Welcome to Into Theology. My name is Wyatt Graham, and I'm joined with Ian Clary, and we're talking about Calvin's Institutes of Christian Religion, and we're in chapters 15 and 16 today, which talk about the human body, free will, God's providence, and probably many other topics besides. It's pretty broad. It's a packed couple chapters. Calvin here is kind of moving from, he talks about this kind of twofold knowledge, knowing God, knowing ourselves. Here he's kind of turning to who we are, but knowing God is never far behind. It always seems to be pretty connected in Calvin. You can't separate those things too finely. In fact, it's a bit of a confusing twofold knowledge that Calvin has because it always seems a bit mixed together. Here we though see ourselves, and it begins by talking about our nature. We're going to learn about Adam, how Adam was before the fall, how humanity is after the fall, and there's going to be different ways that works, but we can kind of see what the body is like if we look at a section in chapter 15 and in section 2. So I'm just going to read a relatively long passage here, and I want to do that just because it's so it's weird to our ears, and I think that makes it interesting to hear. So Calvin says this, and I'm beginning at the beginning of section 2. Furthermore, that man consists of a soul and body ought to be beyond controversy. Now I understand by the term soul an immortal yet created essence, which is his nobler part. Sometimes it is called spirit, for even when these things are joined together, they differ from one another in meaning. Yet when the word spirit is used by itself, it means the same thing as soul, as when Solomon, speaking of death, says that then the spirit returns to God who gave it. And when Christ commended his spirit to the Father, and Stephen his to Christ, they meant only that when the soul is freed from the prison house of the body, God is its perpetual guardian. Some imagine the soul to be called spirit for the reason that it is breath or a force divinely infused into bodies, but that it nevertheless is without essence. Both the thing itself and all Scripture show them to be stupidly blundering in this opinion. It is of course true that while men are tied to earth more than they should be, they grow dull. Indeed, because they have become estranged from the Father of lights, they become blinded by darkness, so that they do not think that they will survive death. Yet in the meantime, the light has not been so extinguished in the darkness that they remain untouched by a sense of their own immortality. Surely to God's judgment,
you skipped a line.
The conscience, which discerning between good and evil responds to God's judgment, is an undoubted sign of the immortal spirit. For how could emotion without essence penetrate to God's judgment seat and inflict itself with dread at its own guilt? For the body is not affected by the fear of spiritual punishment, which falls upon the soul only. From this it follows that the soul is endowed with essence. Now the very knowledge of God sufficiently proves that souls, which transcend the world, are immortal. For no transient energy could penetrate to the fountain of life. And then he continues by talking about the mind, which is an immaterial part of our body, or part of the soul, our sense perception, which is our sight, our touch, all that kind of stuff, our intelligence, and so on. In fact, he even has an interesting part about dreams that comes up. Maybe we can talk about that in a second. But just briefly, reflecting on this passage.
Yeah, he did talk a little bit about.
Oh, he definitely did.
Yeah, some curious stuff that's going. Some curious stuff that's going on in here. It's interesting. Right at the very beginning of that section there, number 2, he speaks of the soul and the spirit as interchangeable terms. So it would seem that he holds to the view of what we call dichotomy. So that the trichotomous view, which Luther held to, believed that there was body, soul, and spirit. He sees them both as interchangeable, which is a fairly common enough view in the history of the Christian tradition. But then he's arguing here. This whole section is about trying to prove the immortality of the soul. So he recognizes it as a created thing. God creates it, so it's not eternal in the sense that it's always existed, which certain forms of Greek philosophy would hold to. But nevertheless, it's immortal, and it can exist outside of the body. And then he uses this very interesting term right after his quote in reference to Stephen in Acts 7. He says that they meant only that when the soul is freed from the prison house of the body. And I'm sure that's probably what you're thinking of when you thought, well, this would be interesting to read because it's not familiar to our ears. But I hear that language, and it leads towards a kind of Platonism I think Platonism is great, and I think that Christians need to recapture a certain kind of Christian Platonism. But there are certain pitfalls, and I wonder if the language here sounds like it could be a pitfall that maybe he's falling into. Though Calvin's not so, he's not so ignorant as to just say that flippantly. So what do you think, man? Prison house of the body, or is the prison house of the body is what keeps our souls in?
Right. Well, I have to wonder. I think you're right. I mean, I thought the whole section was kind of interesting, just mind and all that kind of stuff, soul. I guess we can get into mind. But this, I guess, is included in that, implicitly. What is our body? Is it a prison house? Is it clay? I mean, Paul talks about it as clay. We are in our tent, I think he calls it in Corinthians.
Yep.
A tent is a temporary thing that we end up leaving. It's not a permanent residence. And yet at the same time in the New Testament, we are permanently going to be in the body at the resurrection.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly what Calvin is thinking here. Here's my most charitable way to look at this. Calvin knows that our current body is dead. Our soul is alive, and one of the goals of salvation is the resurrection of the body so that it is united perfectly to our soul in this very complementary way. And I suspect when he's talking about the body, he might think the body as it is now after the fall of Adam. And therefore, in a certain sense, all of us know, like, as you get older, you have medical conditions, you get sicker, weaker, it kind of works against you. And the more and more you go on in life, the more and more you're hoping for the resurrection of the body in some way. That's the most charitable way. The less charitable way could be how it just kind of sounds, that Calvin didn't value the body as much as maybe we would today, generally speaking. And you kind of know that because he talks about the soul as the nobler part.
Yeah.
So the soul is more noble than the body, is what Calvin says. And now you have to wonder, what does he mean? And I think all of us who don't really have a substance ontology today.
Yeah, we need to talk to Joshua Ferris.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I want to read that book, actually. That sounds really strange, but you got to remember, when Calvin's talking about the soul, he means our mind, which is the reasoning part, our intellect, which kind of overlaps, our will, the choosing part,
yep,
and all that kind of stuff. So he's not really thinking of some sort of esoteric Casper the Friendly Ghost. He's thinking about how we work in our embodied state. Like, we have reason, we have will, we do all these different things. And so by noble, he possibly just means that part of our constitution which leads and guides us by thinking and choosing. And when you think of it that way, it's a little bit less offensive to our ears. It's not just like he thinks Casper the Friendly Ghost inside of us is better than our flesh, which is weak and unimportant.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, he starts off this whole discussion in 15:1, where he's saying we're going to talk about now the creation of man. He's going to remind us, we have to to really know ourselves, we have to know God, but we also have to know the self, and that whole thing that he deals with in the very beginning of the Institutes. And then he says, actually, to have a knowledge of ourselves, we have to have another twofold knowledge. This one here is we need to know ourselves as we were first created, and then we need to understand ourselves in our condition after the fall of Adam. And so here he's talking about all the kind of like first created stuff, and he's showing that, as you were saying, that within the soul, this immaterial part of ourselves comes first the mind, or the understanding, and then flowing from that comes the power of choice, or the power of the will, and it's the will that governs then our actions, right? And so it seems then that explains why the primacy of the soul over the body, because that's where all the faculties, all the operations are happening that are going to control then the actions of the body. And he's going to go on and say things like, later on in section 2 there, he's going to say that with our intelligence, so he's going back to the mind, which is part of the soul. He says, we can see the invisible God and the angels, something the body can by no means do. And so he's saying that, like, there's this certain sort of perception that we have that's part of our soulish qualities, that's rooted in mind and will, that allows us to see things that, in this, as he's going to say, this house of clay, quoting from Job 4, isn't able to do. And so, and this is all going back to then proving this idea of the immortality of the soul. So your body can die, but now your soul is going to continue on. This sort of explains why, we'll have consciousness, a hyper awareness of God, our surroundings, angelic beings in the intermediate state, And all that stuff's really cool, and I'm following with him. It's just interesting how he has yet okay, that might be the case that the soul is primary. It's just interesting that he's kind of like calling the body a prison house, which it might, again, he's still talking about the pre-fall condition. So yeah, I don't know if he's slipping back and forth here. Is it a prison house because of the sin? I mean, he's going to get into all that stuff in later on in this reading, but yeah, it's very curious.
I'm not entirely sure. I think when you read the whole picture, and he speaks a lot more about certain things about free will in the next book, it feels pretty balanced, but there are some language like the one we've noted here that is just odd.
Yeah,
Odd. It's hard to understand.
In this whole chapter, he's deriding the philosophers, but then he'll say, I think it's in section 6. Said it would be foolish to seek a definition of soul from the philosophers. Of them, hardly one, except Plato, has recently affirmed its immortal substance. And he says, yeah, there's some other followers of Socrates that recognize this too. So he's obviously a very high view of Plato. The philosophers that he'll attack in this section are the Stoics and the Epicureans, who are both relatively, they don't have a view of the immortality of the soul. Highly fatalistic. So he's going to go after them under the Stoics, especially under the Providence section against fatalism. But he has a high view of Plato, and so that again will kind of like further help explain where he's coming from,
right?
But still don't understand the kind of seeming disparagement of the body there.
Yeah, and of Plato, and I think probably Aristotle, he also says in the same section, I indeed agree that the things they teach are true, not only enjoyable, but also profitable to learn, and skillfully assembled by them. But he's quick to say it's one of those things that's interesting. Like, there's lots of things we can study, history, math, all these different things in the world. He kind of views philosophy in terms of anthropology the same way. It's interesting. They make great observations, super helpful.
Yeah.
But, for piety, it's sort of just like an interesting topic, just like any other topic is, and passes over it. And I think for us, when we think of philosophy, we almost think of it as like some competing thing that can, but philosophy for him was essentially just to study the world.
Yeah.
And, I guess more than study the world, but here he's just saying, look, they make great observations about the body. Some of it's super enjoyable, super interesting, just like some of us might love sports or math or English literature or science or biology, but we can just quickly summarize it, and he does. He summarizes Plato and then moves on. He talks about the 5 senses, fantasy, reason, and so on.
It's interesting because he'll kind of like, he's somewhat disparaging of Aristotle at one point, and then I don't remember, I have it marked somewhere, where he's kind of negative on him, and then he's like, yeah, but his views are basically okay. Let's just tweak it a little bit here in terms of the appetite or something. And so even though he kind of wants to be a little bit down on Aristotle, he's still okay with him.
Right.
One of the things I was recently reading in this book here, as I was kind of prepping for this, Richard Muller's book on human willing and choice amongst the Reformation and post-Reformation theologians, makes an observation in the book there that because Calvin doesn't have a theological training, he's trained as a humanist, so obviously he's reading a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers as a humanist writer. Doesn't have the training in the schools the way somebody like Peter Martyr Vermeulen is going to have. So he's not going to have the same level of precision. And there's just going to be some things that he's saying that he's not entirely, as expert on. Like at the very end, I think of 15, it's either 15 or 16. He starts to make 16. He starts to make some distinctions, and he speaks positively of the schools, but you don't really get a lot of that in him. And so I wonder if he'd had a more scholastic grounding, if he'd be more favorable to Aristotle like Vermeulen was. And I think his heavy reading of Augustine, who's obviously very indebted to Plato, also plays into some of where, Calvin comes from.
Yeah, I think so. In the parallel section in book 2, he not only does Augustine, but he spends a great deal of time working through Bernard of Clairvaux, and cites, like, I think there's like a whole page of citations from him. So Calvin is, in some ways, deeply invested in medieval and patristic theology.
Yeah.
It's only certain kinds. He seems to have a particular bias towards contemporary scholastic theology, probably because of the engagement he had with them. but he very rarely, I don't know if he ever refers to Thomas by name, but he kind of does refer to him by, I think he says Thomas's name actually, but it's unclear if he actually read Thomas Aquinas. He
Yeah.
knows of him. Everyone probably knew of him.
Yeah.
If he actually spent that time in that kind of scholastic schooling. It is interesting. He knows Peter Lombard. He can, I think, cite him as well. So yeah, he has a different kind of training, and it's, once you get into the 16th century that Calvin's in, you find that not just Peter Martyr, Vermigli, but a whole group of reformers have similar theology to Calvin, but are very positive towards the scholastic medievals and use them frequently. So I think this is more of a preference and a choice on his part. And yeah, you do see a lot. It is very Platonic, and I'm not against that like you are. I think anyone can
No,
make.
I'm not against it either. I'm just against that.
Yeah.
Where it sounds like, the prison house of the body. If he's wanting to make a distinction, say, hey, like he says it later that it is the house of the body, which is fine.
Right.
And that does reflect some of those texts you were talking about in terms of like, jars of clay, and it's just that negative language. And if it's explicable purely because of the fall, that makes more sense to me, because it's not essential to the human body to be sinful. But it's just hard to tell at this point.
You don't have to make Calvin sound better than he is. I mean, that's one of the nice things about reading these great works. I mean, if Calvin's wrong, he is. He's not
Yep.
scripture, and it's wonderful to know that, because it doesn't make you appreciate him less. You just appreciate him as a human theologian.
Yeah.
And so I think he probably does use language that's unhelpful. He's balanced in the overall theological perspective, but in the way that he presents it, I think, is going to lead people to denigrate the body more than they should. I think that's fine to say. It doesn't make him bad or us better. We're wrong in many areas too. I just think in this case, that's fair to say.
Right. We just have to be careful too. This is my problem, is I want to be careful with disparaging him on this too, because he's no fool, and he knows what he's saying. Every word that he writes is very intentional. So I just want to understand why he says it, because I might actually believe it.
It could be. I find it interesting. You probably read as a dichotomist. He has an immaterial material side. One thing that just kind of reminded me when you're talking is Irenaeus, Leon. So his view is basically the same, except when we get the Holy Spirit, we become trichotomous.
Oh, really? Interesting.
You wouldn't quite say that, but that's the implication, because we're basically body and soul. The Holy Spirit comes and is sort of infused or added to us or participated.
Interesting.
It's a really interesting paradigm. I'd have to read him to figure out exactly what he means, but I just found that kind of a fascinating anecdotal thing to say, I suppose.
Yeah.
The image of God, section 3, it's in the soul.
Yeah.
Body.
Yeah, again, and this is going back to this kind of like body stuff, right? Is that he doesn't want to locate it. He says right at the end of 4, even, he doesn't want to locate it in the dominion mandate, that some will, right? That we're the image of God because of the creation mandate in Genesis. He's saying, no, we can't do that. And he says it's something more in terms of the immaterial aspect of who you are in relationship to the soul. It's also funny there that he doesn't like Augustine's trying to kind of like is seeing in Augustine's psychology the 3 parts to us that kind of echo or correspond to Trinity. He's like, that's stupid. He's like,
I remember that. There was by
no means sound. So he doesn't like Augustine there.
And he doesn't like parts of the soul either. Like you have different soulish parts. Like there's
appetites and.
What's interesting, if I'm right on this, I think I probably am. I think Aristotle was not saying there are 3 souls. There's genres in the soul, the singular.
Yeah.
So I think I have to double check and do my homework, I'm sure, but I think Calvin's actually wrong on his reading of, if that's Aristotle, because Aristotle doesn't actually say we have 3 souls. It's the genre of souls, the type of soul.
Yeah, I'd have to go back. My good friend who teaches out here at Metro Denver, his name's Caleb Coho, and he did his PhD at Princeton on Aristotle and the soul. So I'm helping him move this weekend, so I'll have to ask him.
Yeah, ask him that question and kind of report back. Because I don't know if I'm 100% right. That's my thought, anyways.
Yeah. Let's move on. What else we got? Because there's lots more to cover here. What about Adam, the fall?
Okay.
That's a big one.
Why did Adam fall?
Yeah, we don't know. We know certain things about his condition, right? He's created pre-fall without any kind of flaw. He's given mind.
Yep.
as he says in number 8 here, right? So the mind allows him to distinguish things between good and evil, right from wrong, and then added to that is the power of choice, and that directs the appetites, and then thus controlling the body as the body acts. Then, and he has absolute free will. In the he says the will maintains its integrity in the pre-fall state.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, at this point, I'm just talking about Adam's condition. I don't want to get into predestination right now. So he
Yeah.
tells us that, which is kind of funny, but it's coming. And he says Adam could have stood if he wanted to, and fell entirely by his own will. So there's nothing in God that compelled him to do that. And so then it was an absolute free choice for him to do it. And so he's kind of describing the state, but doesn't yet kind of get into the question really, at least unless I'm missing something, of the why it happened.
Yeah, I think the only answer he really gives in section 8 is, therefore Adam could have stood if he wished, seeing that he fell solely by his own will.
Yep.
It was because his will was capable of being bent to one side or the other, and was not given the constancy to persevere that he fell so easily. But the highest rectitude it was in his mind and will, and so on. So he doesn't
It's interesting that he talks about perseverance there, right?
yeah.
He could have, but he was not. So God does not endow Adam with this. Sorry, there's an airplane going over my head here. I don't know if you can hear that or not. Can you hear that?
Yeah, that's fine. It's the FBI checking you out.
Yeah, it's Big Brother.
Big brother.
Yes, but he doesn't have the constancy to persevere. So he's upright. He has the ability to distinguish between good and evil, and he has the power to choose one or the other. But it seems almost like he doesn't, as Calvin saying, he doesn't have the power to persevere if there's the choice, the temptation to choose evil. He doesn't persevere through that temptation. Seems
Yeah.
like, but that's also not a defect in Adam either.
It's not a defect. But he had the power of deliberation between one and the other. So there is a school of thought that essentially says this is a bit different, but our power of deliberation, our gnomic will, is, I think, an effect of the fall. And the more and more we come closer to God, the less we have the power to deliberate. And that actually gives us free will again, because the only choice you have is the best choice. You're not free to choose worse choices.
Which makes sense then when we get to heaven, right? Because that just gets amplified to the fullest degree.
So I think that'd be like Maximus the Confessor, but anyways. So
but he's going to go on and attack the philosophers again. He says the philosophers are sort of helpful when we're trying to understand the way they rationalize about the human condition now. It's maybe helpful for understanding, humans in their pre-fall state. But now, because the philosophers don't have a doctrine of sin or a doctrine of the fall, they're just going to fail. They're going to mix things up all the time.
Right, which is criticism.
Yeah. He also talks about the absolute freedom of God here. There was no, he says, nor was it reasonable for God to be constrained by the necessity of making a man who either could not or would not sin at all. Such a nature would indeed have been more excellent. So he's saying if God had decided to make Adam with the ability to not fall, that would have been great. But there was nothing in terms of God.
That would be more excellent? Where does he say that?
He says it right on 196 of the Battles, McNeill. It's just past footnote 32. And so he's saying that, it would be great if Adam had been created without the ability to fall. But there's nothing that constrains God to have had to have created him that way. God is absolutely free in terms of his ability to have done something like this. And where does the reason why God decided to create Adam in the state where he has this kind of power of contrary choice? He says it lies hidden in God's plan. We don't know. And it goes back to this whole idea what we were talking about before, like you really just can't speculate at certain points.
This will go into something that we'll get into probably in book two, I suppose, but kind of like why Christ came and the atonement, whether it's necessary or voluntary, or I don't remember the exact particular language, but Calvin seems to say that God chose this one for his own purposes.
Yep.
It could be many other ways it could have been done. And in this case, there could have been a more excellent state for Adam as well than he was before the fall.
Yeah.
I think that's important. We've moved theologically to a place where I think our knee jerk is to say this is the only possible way everything has to be.
Yeah.
Where I think Calvin wants to protect the freedom of God a bit more than that.
Big time. Yeah. And that's a very hard thing to do, to understand God's freedom, right? Because we're contingent beings. And so there's something necessary about us in the world that we live in. God is absolutely free of contingencies. I mean, he acts according, Calvin's going to get into, like, in this next section on providence, about God's omnipotence, what it is and what it isn't. But, there's nothing constraining upon God, I guess, really, than his own nature.
Well, let's get into providence just briefly as we kind of begin to finish the arc of this episode. What do we want to say about providence? What is really fascinating?
There's lots. I mean, this is a really, really important part of Calvin's theology. So I'd say this is probably a very core part of the Institutes here when he's talking about providence. And he's going to write on it. You'll see in the footnotes, there are other references to Calvin's other writings on these issues. And so it's a big deal. He is really concerned to uphold the idea that God is actively involved in his creation. So he says that God is not, he'll say right in kind of in the end of that first paragraph of section 3 under chapter 16, that God is not merely some sort of first agent or first cause that sets everything in motion. And so therefore all of the kind of like unfolding of nature can be attributable to God, but these secondary causes are almost like irrelevant to what God's doing. And he's saying, no. God has not only created and set everything in motion, but he's also intimately involved in his providential care. So he makes a kind of comparison on the top of page 202, that God's providence pertains no less to his hands than to his eyes. So he's not just sitting back observing things, but his hands are involved. So he's actually intimately involved. And so he on the top of 203, he's talking about then this relationship between watching and caring. So he's watching in order that he can care. And then later he'll attribute that to God's fatherly care. Remember where I have that noted, but so I like that. It's the idea then that God really actually does care about things.
No, yeah. So providence is God's kind of personal fatherly care of all things that come to pass, whether special or general. Good question for you. Does the word providence appear in the Bible?
No.
I find that interesting. I think that's right. And providence is a philosophical commonplace.
Yeah, providentia, the Stoic notion, right? The Stoics who Calvin's railing against here. And that's what he's careful to do, right? He's saying, listen, upholding a view of providence, but it's not the Stoic view. It's not fatalism.
And I think that goes back to, reality is created by God, and there's certain things you can observe that are just in your face true. The invisible things of God and his power are there. You can't deny it. And providence is one of those things. It's a Romans 1 item. So you have to talk about it. And scripture does under different words for sure. I mean, I think, was it Psalm 104 and all this kind of stuff? Like, it's all throughout scripture, but providence itself is something derived from natural theology. It's an observation of natural theology, but scripture talks about it, if that makes sense. Not that they're in conflict at all.
But he's also very careful to kind of rightly frame his natural theology. Like he talks again in the next paragraph in number 3, that we've got to be very careful that we don't defraud God of his glory if all we do is make appeals to universal laws of nature. We have to see those laws as actually being directly governed by God moment by moment, instead of just a deistic view of the universe being set in motion.
It's interesting. I won't talk about it, but I've been kind of reading like David Hume and things like that recently. I'm just kind of thinking through causation and some of the where God was the invisible means of causation and effect. Kind of just reminded me of that when you said that. Well, I think that's helpful. I think we can we've gone about half an hour. We've talked through these topics. I have to admit that I think I forgot to read this chapter, so I don't want to say anything about it. I've read it before. I have markings all over it. I think I finished at 15 somehow. So I like that God's fatherly care, God's providence is his care of creation. And I think we're getting into some really interesting, tricky topics. And we're so close to book 2 where I think a lot of this opens up into topics that we are really excited to talk about.
Yeah.
And I cheated and read ahead a little bit on his free will section in book 2. And I think it's going to be so interesting once we get there. He says a lot of things that are maybe unexpected, that we're not used to hearing. And I think really quite helpful. So next week, so this is chapters 15 and 16. Next week are chapters 17 and 18. And then we finish book 1 out of 4. So we're already a quarter of the way there when you just count the book.
Awesome.
Although book 4 is really long.
Yeah.
But nonetheless,
Awesome.
we're getting close. So thanks, Ian, and we'll see you next week.
Sounds good.